So it's my pleasure to introduce Amy and Manon. The title of tonight's program is Everything You Wanted to Know About Composting. And I wanted to add, but we're afraid to ask, or I've already failed 3 times and I don't, you know, what am I doing wrong? So, so first I'll introduce Manon. Manon started gardening in 2005 when her daughter asked her a question and she didn't know the answer. She's been looking for answers and sharing them with her community ever since. She studied seed saving with Ketchum local Bill McDorman, who started High Altitude Seeds many years ago. Is still in the seed business. He's a master seed, I guess a seed master is what you'd say. Manon is a master gardener. She helped found Valley Victory Gardens and has taught many classes locally over the years and now has her own YouTube gardening channel. Amy is the co-director of the Wood River Seed Library, and she's also the co-director of the Local Food Alliance, which is a program of the Sun Valley Institute. She serves on the Blaine County Food Council, and she's a board member of the Idaho Center for Sustainable Agriculture. She has worked with many organizations committed to the local food movement, including Idaho's Bounty, Nourish Me, and Cray's Market Garden. So if we were live, I'd say, please welcome Amy and Manon. So we'll just, you know, silently applaud. so thank you, Amy and Manon. Really looking forward to this.
Thanks for having us. Such a pleasure.
Thank you, Kristen. So I'm sharing my slides here, and I may not go through every single slide in here, but you'll have access to them once we're done. We'll send you the link to those slides. And please do ask questions as we go along. I'd rather answer your questions than go through these slides. So please make sure that your questions get answered. And we're having another workshop on Thursday, and I'll talk about it on Friday, on Saturday. Saturday, October 3, we're actually going to build compost bins at the Grange and start the compost. So that'll be another opportunity to learn about composting. So, you know, anyone can do composting, and you don't need to be the user of the compost. You can make it and give it to someone else, or you can use it on your lawn, or you can use it just to reduce your amount of trash, actually. You can use compost as a fertilizer. You can use it as a mulch. You can use it as a soil amendment. And I use them for all these uses, and it can be used on the garden, on lawns, and potted plants, both outdoors and indoor. And it saves you a lot of money because it's expensive to buy compost, and the quality of the compost you can make at home is much higher than the compost you can buy in the bag. Even though you may think industry produces the best, no, your home compost may be the best thing in the world. So the composting process, it takes in greens and brown as an input, plus these greens and browns and the environment around it contain the decomposers, which are bottom left, microorganisms, microbes, fungi, worms, and insects. They do the decomposition for us. And as an output, you know, you get water evaporation, you get heat, and carbon dioxide. So that the greens and brown provide carbon and nitrogen and other things too. But yeah, you put carbon in and you get carbon dioxide out. So it's very important to have carbon and to have a mix of carbon and nitrogen, so that that feeds the microorganism who will want to decompose all that matter. And your compost needs air, so it needs to be aerated. If it's too compact or if it's never turned, it will decompose much, much slower. So there are different ways that matter break down. You can just, clip it, cut it, and you end up with straw or plant stems. And you can use those as mulching, as mulch. You can do chipping. If you have branches, you can chip them and use that as mulch. And mulch, part of it is dry and part of it is the part that's in contact with the soil decomposes slowly. So it serves two purposes. It protects and it decomposes slowly, whatever's in contact with the soil. But what we're talking about tonight is vermicomposting, which is the tropical worms doing a job. It's not the earthworm. When we talk about worm bins, it's a tropical worm that does the work, and the worm castings that result, it's essentially the poop of the worms, right? And these are very rich. It's a very rich fertilizer. And you can do that in your house. I do that in my house. And the cold and slow decomposition, that's typically what we do at home. And the hot and fast decomposition, that's mostly what the industry does. They build a pile all at once. They make sure they have a source of oxygen going in at the bottom. And voila, within 2-3 months, they have a composted pile. But you need to do a big pile in order to generate that heat and to sustain that heat, which we don't do as a homeowner. And as a homeowner, we feed debris or vegetable cuttings to our compost, on a weekly basis. It's not like we feed them a big batch every 3 months. We feed them a little every day. So we're not in a position to build a pile all at once and make it heat up. So that's why home composting is mostly the cold decomposition, which we will talk about later, but it ends up being a better quality compost than the hot compost for our gardens. And the compost you generate is a storehouse for plant nutrients. And it has a lot of microorganisms. If you've heard about microbiome, the soil microbiome depends on the rich microbiome in your compost. You're enriching the microbiome of your soil by having a rich compost. When you do a hot compost, you're actually killing a lot of the organisms because it's too hot for them. If you do cold compost, it takes more time, but you're nurturing this microbiome that you want for your body. So anything at your body temperature, around 90 to 100 degree, is body temperature. So that's the same microbiome that your body needs. So by doing composting, you're helping your own microbiome because that microbiome ends up on your vegetables. So the living components in your compost are the microbes and the bacteria, but also what we call the macroorganisms, which are the insects, their larvae, the earthworms, and the fungi. And they all have a job to do in your compost. So when we compost, we need a mix of greens and brown. And in the industry, they would calculate very specifically, each ingredient will have this proportion of carbon and this proportion of nitrogen. But as a home gardener, we just say we put about 50-50 browns and greens. So you don't have to be concerned about the details. And your browns are things like dry leaves. So if you have a green leaf, that's a green. But if you have a dry leaf, it becomes a carbon. It's the drying process reduces the nitrogen proportion. So, you know, something can be brown or green depending on whether it's dry or fresh. So your dry leaves, the leaves that fall off the trees, and the curly leaves are better than the flat leaves, like your aspen leaves. They're flat and they're kind of waxy, so they take more time to decompose. The curly leaves, like from maple trees, they're curly, so they keep more oxygen around them, and they decompose faster, so they're better in your compost. But if all you have is aspen leaves, that's fine too. You can use straw, your shrub trimmings. You can use paper, newspaper, sawdust, and wood shaving. But you don't want to have too much sawdust and wood shavings. And any dry vegetation, so anything that comes from your garden, any plant material you're removing from your garden. Lint from your dryer is something I put in my compost too. Even the dust, if I use a broom to dust the floor, this goes in my compost. And the greens that are nitrogen rich typically are all your kitchen scraps, the vegetable kitchen scraps, the grass clippings, and your hair. If you cut hair, if you cut your own hair, or you go to the hairdresser, bring your hair back, put it in your compost. Why not? Vegetables, any vegetable stems and leaves, and fresh manure. So from different animals, fresh manure would be considered a green. It's high in nitrogen, but as it's maturing, like if it's 3 years old, it's probably now a brown rather than a green.
Just one quick thing to add into that. I think the more diversity you have in your browns and greens, the more diversity you're going to have in that finished compost. So you may have heard Manon say, like, not too much wood shavings or sawdust, but if that's what you have, that's totally okay. You just want to balance that with nitrogen, but we really want to see diversified inputs into the compost pile to get as much, because all those microorganisms prefer different materials. So the more diverse materials you have in there, the more diverse microbes you have in there eating it. So just going to throw that one in there.
Good comment, Amy. Thank you.
We always like diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, many things can be composted. I'm not going to read through all of that, but you can put bread in. Coffee grounds are great. And their coffee grounds are actually, they look brown, but they're actually considered a green because they contain a lot of nitrogen. You can add compost to your compost. Compost, partially decomposed or fully decomposed compost from a previous batch will act almost as a starter in your compost. Corn husks, eggshells, save your eggshells, put them in your compost. You crush them. Ideally, I crush them small and then I add them crushed, because they don't get really crushed much in the compost, but they're great. They provide calcium. Even evergreen needles. Some people will tell you, don't use pine needles, they're too acidic. Well, our soil is too alkaline here, so stop telling me. Yeah, we need some of them, not too much. Again, you know, not just that, but you can use them. I leave most of my evergreen needles and pine cones around my pine tree. That's where they're best. They do a great mulch around your pine tree.
Manon, we have a couple of questions that slipped in that I was busy listening to you and not checking the chat. So somebody asked a question, what about dairy? I sometimes put old yogurt in my compost. Is that bad? And then, haha, never thought about dryer lint. And then someone asked, you were talking about coffee, and they said, do you add the filters too, or just the coffee grounds themselves? So several questions in there.
Most filters are decomposable, so you can put the filters also. If they're paper filters, yes, you can put them in. What was the other question? Yogurt. If it's a whole milk yogurt, I would hesitate to put it in, And mostly because any fat will attract critters to your compost pile. You can use some, a little bit won't hurt, but I would not go out of my way to, you know, add that to my compost pile.
And if you do, you want to cover it. So that would be like put it in the middle and cover it with a bunch of carbon so it's not so attractive.
Or dilute it.
Dilute it with water.
If I have the end of a container, put water, fill it with water, shake it, and dump the whole thing in your compost.
And you could do that with milk, cream, diluting it. This actually feeds the microbes pretty nicely. Quick note on the filter question, because I also see that you have tea bags on here. Some of those are now made with microplastics. They can go into the soil. There's been some studies that worms are eating microplastics. I look at it of I'd rather have it go in my backyard and decompose 99% than have it all go into a landfill where it's not decomposing at all. So I think that's just something that we kind of have to think about and make a choice that works really good for us and makes us feel good. But I know for me, I'd rather decompose my coffee filter in my compost, and maybe some of those microplastics end up in my garden much better than, in my opinion, than going all to a landfill. So
yeah. Even a bag, you know, these bags that are paper outside and plastic inside, if you put that in your compost, the worms will eat all of the paper and leave the plastic. And once you go to stir your compost, you see a piece of plastic, you remove it. Mm-hmm. It's that simple. You know, it's not a big deal. Did I answer all the questions from that question? Yeah, good. So what not to put in your compost, it's anything that will produce strong odors, especially fish. Anything that would attract pests, like oily foods. And so you don't want butter or bones. Or I've made bone meal with bones before, but and when I put it in my garden, it does attract pests. So, you know, it's better at home. If you're on a big farm, you may not care, but if you're in a home, you may not want to attract too many pests to your home. Yeah, mayonnaise, yeah, you can put the eggshells, but not the egg itself. Mayonnaise, meats and poultry, peanut butter, too oily, salad dressing, you don't want to put that in. Vegetable oil, don't put that in. And the other thing you don't want is anything that will have weeds, especially the noxious weeds, or the weeds that, like, you could put the leaves or the stems of a weed if it's not a weed that propagates from stems, right? Or don't put the rhizomes of what's the bindweed?
Bindweed.
Don't put the rhizomes of bindweed in your compost. It will multiply like mad. So, but you can put, you know, most weeds, if they don't have flowers and seeds on them, you can put them there. And if you don't care about having dandelions in your garden, put your dandelion flowers in. You know, it's annual weeds. I don't care so much as perennial weeds that that are really bothersome. And any material that's diseased, I don't put them in. And things to never put in a compost, especially at home, is manure from cats and dogs, or I would say any animal that is not vegetarian. You don't want in your compost. Any diseased plants, you don't want in your compost. And my values are anything that has pesticide or herbicide in it, I don't want in my compost, because I don't want to eat those. So in terms of manure, the manure have components, the nutrients that will not be in vegetables. So it's good to have a mix. Again, you want diversity. You want vegetable compost, but you can add manure to the compost or mix them together, either before or after they're composted. And you can use cow, beef, horse, llama, ostrich, you know, hog, goat, sheep, whatever, rabbits. chicken, bats, any bird. I actually go out of my way to collect elk and deer poop and moose poop, and I put that in my compost. They're local animals, they're wild animals, and I love it. There are things you have to be aware that I would not use manure from a feedlot. You know, antibiotics and all the herbicides. In feedlots, they actually spray herbicides on the poop piles so it doesn't attract flies, right? So I would avoid anything from a feedlot or from the industry. But if you know someone who has horses and cows that, you know, is not industrial, sure, please use them. But you don't apply fresh manure to near a food crop in the spring. You have to allow it to mature and to cure and remove any pathogens if there are any. So I already talked about hot composting. The rule of thumb is that to do a hot compost pile, you need at least 3 by 3 or 6 by 6 by 6 pile to bring your compost to be hot enough. Some people say, well, I do a hot compost, I put it on the south side of my house and it has sun all day long. But hot composting doesn't mean baked by the sun. Baking only dehydrates. What the heat from the composting comes from the activity of all the microorganisms. It comes from the chemical reactions in your pile.
So the center of your compost is where that heat is, not the outside of your compost.
Right. So, yeah, and it has to be sustained at 140 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 weeks to kill seeds, to kill most weed seeds. But it also kills bacteria, and the good bacteria that you want, the most sensitive bacteria that you want in your microbiome. But if you're starting a garden and all you have is, you know, the hot compost that you buy from Wynn's Compost or any other local or industrial, yeah, you have to use it at some point. But once you have your own compost going, it's just, you can feel the difference, you can smell the difference, you can taste the difference in your vegetables. So this is cold or passive composting is what we mostly do at home. So typically the heat is around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and then every time you will add some greens from your kitchen and you cover it up with some browns, you'll go the next day, put your hand on it, and you'll realize it's warm. You know, it's all, and but that heat will dissipate very fast because it was a small quantity. It decomposes slowly. So some things will decompose in 6 months, some things will take 12 months. And if you put things like avocado peels or pits, it might take 2 years. So I don't always put them in, or if I put them in, you know, and I find them, if I go to my finished compost pile, I put them back in my new pile and give them more time to decompose. So a passive composting can be, you just, you know, put things in a pile, add some browns, add some greens once in a while when you think of it. You may add a little water once in a while when you realize it's too dry. You don't want to drown it in water because your microbes and your earthworms won't like that. But with minimal care, it will decompose. It will decompose more slowly than if you mix it regularly. Every time you mix it, you introduce more oxygen in your pile, and you put the carbon in contact with your nitrogen. But the main point is the oxygen and aerating your compost. And when you mix it, that's when you can realize, oh, it's too dry, I'll add a little bit of water. So you need all of that. You need water and oxygen for the composting to go faster. But if you don't provide it, it'll decompose over time, but it'll take more time. I already talked about most of these items. So in my view, the compost I produce at my home is worth gold. It's so rich. It's full of worms. It's full of micro and macro organisms. It just looks so rich, and you can't buy that. When you buy a sack of compost, they dehydrate it, so it doesn't weigh as much in the transportation. Well, when they dehydrate it, they kill most of the microorganisms. They probably kill most of the macroorganisms. Oh, you won't find a worm or, you know, a pill bug in a bag, but you want those things. So your home compost is worth much more than anything you can buy in a bag, in my view. That's my personal opinion.
We do have a question from Blakesley.
Yeah.
Who asks, if you're heavy on greens and light on browns, will that slow down the process? And then goes on to say, I rarely put browns in mine. It is mostly vegetable compost.
Yes. Well, eventually your greens will dry up and will become browns, right? So it will just take a little more time to decompose. And because your greens are wetter and heavier, they will they'll be maybe lacking some oxygen, and it might stink a little bit more than if it's the right mix. But it will work. And that's when I started composting. I had a little condo with a tiny backyard. I had this tiny bin, and I just kept putting things in and never stirred, never. And eventually it decomposed, but it took a long time to decompose. But if that's what you're willing to do, sure, do that. If you want to be a little more efficient, add some browns. But just know what you're willing to do and what it's worth to you. In my case, I know how much compost I need every year for my garden, so I make sure I produce that much compost. And there's only 2 of us in the house, but we do eat a lot of vegetables, so we compost. So this is what my kitchen counter looks like. Very cute. I have eggshells on the windowsill. I have this little container where we put the coffee grinds. And I use that little thing because it has holes in the top portion, and the coffee grinds don't go moldy before I actually take them out. I don't like the mold to develop in my house. I don't mind if they develop in my bin outside, but in my house, I don't like that. So I used to use a plastic container, and it constantly got moldy. So then I switched to this little container that has holes at the bottom, and so there's kind of a little saucer at the bottom that collects the liquid if there's any. So I separate, there's a reason why I separate my coffee grinds. Actually, there's 2 reasons. One is to control the molds, because my whole compost bin would go moldy. And the other reason is that I like to give that to my worms, but everything that's in my collection bin here on the right, the worms don't like all of those things. So I'm very selective about what I give to my worms. So I separate the coffee grinds. They love the worms love the coffee grinds. I separate them. The onion skins, the reason I separate that is some onions have mold on them, or onions and garlic might have a virus. And once you have that virus in your ground, it's there forever. And you'll carry that virus from year to year on your onions, which means you won't be able to keep your onions. They'll they'll get diseased every year. So I always put my onion skins in there, especially if they have any sign of disease or mold. I don't put them in my compost. I put them in that bin, and most of the time that ends up in my trash, in my trash can. But if I let it dry completely before I put it in my compost, I feel better about that. It won't develop the molds or the disease. It won't propagate the disease so much after it's dry. So that's what I do. And I also have a container in the fridge. You see this container in the middle. It's the container with the warm food, because I do warm composting as well as outdoor, bin composting. And this is the amount that container, I fill that container, and that's the amount I feed my worm every week. So once a week, when you have a worm bin, you cannot handle that like your compost pile outside. You cannot, if you overfeed your worms, and we use the word feeding because that's the mindset you have to have when you have a worm bin. You have to feed your worms no more than they need and no less than they need. You have to give them the amount that they like to have. And that's about the quantity that works for me for my worm bin. And I'm very selective about what I put in there. I only put things that are cut small. I don't put onions or garlic or anything that's strong like ginger. I put things that the worms like, and I don't put things that may be harmful for the worms. You have to remember that these are tropical worms. They're not our local earthworms. We don't keep earthworms indoors. They don't have the same behavior, and they don't eat the same things at the same rate. So
for those interested, they're usually red wiggler worms, yes. And they're known as leaf litter worms. So they like to live in the dark, but not necessarily down in the soil. In tropical areas, they would be living in the top of the soil area where a lot of leaf matter or dead plant matter would be. So just a little bit of a background there, and they're incredible. I've had mine for, I think, 2 years now, and it's my go-to. I love it. So I highly recommend worm bins for people. And they're easy to keep as long as you keep them relatively clean. They don't get stinky. I've had fruit flies in it maybe once or twice because I put something in it with fruit flies, like a rotting tomato kind of thing. But I keep it in my laundry room. So no smell, not gross, pretty cool.
Great, thank you. So the next step after, you have to collect your greens, and I dump them out once or twice a week. So I have this bin, I have several bins. If you have a single bin, then you put it in your bin. If you have several bins, then there's one bin that's labeled my fresh compost, my beginning process. And that's where I put the kitchen clippings. And most every time after I add the greens to my bin, and here I just restarted this bin because I just transferred whatever was in there to my second bin. I put leaves at the bottom, and so every time I put my greens in, I push the browns on top of the greens. And if there aren't enough in there, then I'll take some from another bin that's next to it, and I'll add them in. And I just mix it with this branch. So this stick here is just a branch that has kind of this shape at the end, because there were several branches here and I just cut them off, so it has some kind of a hand at the end. And I just use that to mix the top of my compost. I don't go to the trouble of mixing the whole thing. I just mix kind of the top of my bin. So if you have several bins, you would have maybe your fresh dumping in one bin, and then once that bin is full, you would transfer the whole contents of that bin into a second bin. And then once that's full, you would transfer the contents of that into another bin. And every time you do this transfer, you're aerating your compost. And you can be checking for moisture, make sure that there's even moisture throughout. If not, you water. And as you see things in there that are recognizable and not decompose, like if you have banana peels, they take more time to decompose. So you would take them out of your finished compost, put them back in your first bin, and the next time around they might be decomposed enough. But when I transfer them from the first bin to the second bin, they're kind of partially decomposed, but not really recognizable so much. And you see the lady on the right there, they're sifting compost, and I have another, I'll talk about that a little more. So here is my finished compost bin. So that's my third bin. So I transfer from my fresh bin to my intermediate bin to my, oh, my compost is finished. And I put it in this bin. So when I collect, so I always put the compost at the top of the bin, and when I collect it at the bottom. So there's a door that slides up and down. So I collect my compost from the bottom, and I can use that as is. You can see how dark and well decomposed it is, except for some straw that is in there. So there are, your finished compost still has things in various stages of decomposition, but you should not be able to recognize what it came from, except for maybe the straw or the sticks that are in it. So you can use that as is, as an amendment to mix with your soil. You can use that in a potting, in a pot as potting soil, as is. You can use that as a mulch. So every fall I use that compost and I apply it on top of my beds. And then I cover that with more mulch. But on the left here, you can see this, it's my fancy sifting system. When I need a small quantity of compost, I sift compost so that I have a very fine compost in February and March when I start my seeds. I make my own seed starting mix and I use my fine compost. So you see the little bucket at the center bottom, that's my fine sifted compost. And on the right, it's what's left in this sifter, which is actually a French fry basket that I bought in a kitchen store. That was the cheapest and smallest thing I could think of to sift my compost. But I also made that bigger box there that you see at the top left. So it's just 2x4s and some kind of a heavy screen. Can't remember what they call that. I got that from Idaho Lumber. And so I made the size of that box to fit on this wheelbarrow that I have. So when I want to sift things in a large quantity, I put it on top of my wheelbarrow. But if I need a small quantity just to fill my bucket for February, I use the French fry one. So in the fall, I make sure I bring in all the compost I will need inside for my indoor plants and to start my seeds in the spring. Because in my compost bins, which are here, these are my compost bins. And they're on the north side of my garage. So in the spring, it's all frozen, right? In March, when I want to start my seeds, it's all frozen. There's no way I can access it. Some years it's literally covered by a few feet of snow. So in the fall, I make sure I bring in all the compost I need in 2 buckets, sifted in my garage, ready to go. So another thing I do is I use.
Manon, could I interrupt you for just a second? I want to share a story, personal story, but we have another question from Linda. Are there any issues with damping off fungus in your sifted compost to start seedlings?
It's all a matter of humidity. You want your seeds to start quickly. So I use a heat mat. And if your seed starting is too wet, it might cause the damping off. It might cause molds on the little seedlings and kill them as they just born, which is really sad. So
and Manon, just to clarify, you're not seeding just in compost. You're mixing compost with other materials.
Yes,
to make a potting soil.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the industry wants you to think that they're sterilized and, you know, potting soil is better than your own soil. It's not. It's not.
So I just wanted to share a cautionary tale. When I lived in Pocatello, and it has nothing to do with the containers that Manon just showed, but I had a compost bin like the round one that she showed, and my neighbor also had one. I wasn't doing a very good job composting, and I sort of forgot about it, but my next door neighbor tried to compost. I know nothing about his methodology, how much he thought about it, what he knew. I don't know anything. What I know is I was sitting in the living room and my dog came running through the door, and she was practically frothing at the mouth and her eyes were dilated and she was shaking all over and just almost twitching. And I mean, I knew this dog really well, and I knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. So I called the vet and they said, call the poison control line for pets, which I did. And they said, you know, walk me through the symptoms. So I did. And they said, I think your dog has some sort of neurological poison, has ingested a neurological poison. You should get the dog to the vets immediately. So, you know, I drove the 8 or 10 miles at a fairly frantic rate to my vet, and they gave her some sort of powerful shots to not react, but react against this neurological toxin. But she almost died. And I mean, she was a 75-pound dog. She was a good sized dog. And then we started to try to figure out what it was. Well, it turned out that my lovely next door neighbor was moving his compost bin, and he was moving it from one place to another, and he thought he had cleaned up all the stuff at the bottom, which was slimy and mucky. And so he moved it, and then he scraped and raked where the bin had been. And he thought he had cleaned that all up. It turned out he hadn't, and she had ingested botulism. And so she, like I say, she was a very, I mean, I had the vet tell me, I don't know if we're going to be able to save her. And of course, when I talked to my neighbor, John, I said, John, is there anything that you guys might have done that, you know, blah, blah. And he's like, oh no, you know, we moved the compost bin and we saw a raven over near there. We didn't think anything about it. So just a caution that when Manon talks about, you know, when you move it the next time and you put your shovel in the bottom, it should be dry and loose. It shouldn't be packed down and slimy. If it's packed down and slimy, it could be potentially fatal. to a child. I mean, it's just botulism. So it could be a child, it could be a dog, a cat, you know, a deer, whatever. So just a cautionary tale that was really a horrendous experience for me. So
And don't put disease material in your box. If you put, you know, dairy or you know, anything that has botulism on it in your pile, it will multiply. If you're,
right.
especially if your pile is unhealthy, because if you have a healthy pile and a healthy microbiome in your pile, it will fight the pathogens.
Exactly.
But if
And what
it's
it was it wasn't an aerobic
right,
decomposition. It was an anaerobic. So there was
that's right. Yeah.
oxygen in there.
So you have to be
So
careful
those
not to overwater. And
neurotoxins
it's
develop.
if you have an open pile, it's best to cover the top so that when it rains, I know it doesn't rain here often, but if when it rains, it might pour. And so it may be better to cover your pile so that the rain doesn't soak your pile, especially at the bottom, especially if you have containers or if you have a soil that is not draining at the bottom. You don't want your compost to be sitting in a pool of water. Very, very important. So that's very good point, Kristen.
Oh, here's another question from Kathleen this time. Do you leave your 3 bins full over the winter? Do you have any rodent problems?
I don't have rodent problems myself, and I live just across from the Quigley fields, so they could easily cross the road and come here. I don't have a rodent problem, but my bins are completely closed, so the rodents can't get in. I did know, what I do notice is there is a rabbit. Every winter there's a rabbit that comes and has a little nest behind my compost pile because it's warmer there. And there's an animal, a smart animal that figured out how to open the door of my compost bin and sometimes goes there and eats, I guess. So, but in winter I don't have any problem.
Do you
And
keep your bins full over the winter?
well, my bins are typically full, but they don't have to be. I mean, it's going to end up freezing anyway. My compost is, you know, frozen, a frozen block in the winter when it gets really, really cold. So it's going to freeze anyway. It doesn't matter if you leave it full or half full. But yeah, mine are typically full. And I keep, as long as I can walk around and there's not too much ice around my bin, I keep going there and dumping my fresh greens into it. But the reason I have a warm bin indoors is that I want to be able to continue to have the composting process active in the winter. And so the worms are indoors and they continue to decompose the matter in the winter. Whereas my compost bins in the winter, I would say from December to March, they're frozen solid, then there's no decomposition happening at that time.
And just quickly on the critters, I know one of my friends was asking me, she's out Warm Springs, like how could she compost and keep it bear proof? And there are compost tumblers that are elevated off the ground and you can put locks on them. Yeah, there's a great example of them. So that could be something too, like if you're an area that has a lot of rodents or voles, lifting it up off the ground is going to be the quickest and easiest solution. The tumblers can also be really helpful for turning for people who don't want to pitchfork turn it. So just going to add that one in there for bear safe composting.
But one note about a drum type compost, they say you can compost in a few weeks and that, but that's if you put a pile in with the right mix of browns and greens all at once, and then you keep turning it. And after 10 weeks, ta-da, you have your compost. But most typical homeowners, that's not what they do. They want to be able to add some every week. And with a tumbler, it doesn't necessarily work that way. So you don't save that much time if you're not willing to do I do a pile every 2.5 months. So most people I know who have a tumbler, they use it for one cycle and then they stop using it. So if all you have is a very small space, and I have a friend who actually has a big space, but this is what she does. She has a series of 5-gallon buckets, and she just does the same process I do in my big bins. She puts her fresh stuff in one, and then she transfers it to the next. And she says, sometimes I don't even transfer it, I leave it there. But just make sure that you're mixing your browns and your greens. And if you're in your garage, I tried bringing dead leaves in my garage and quickly realized I was bringing bugs into my garage all winter. So I decided, well, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to use newspaper that don't have bugs on it as my browns for the winter, or inside my garage. But if your buckets are outside, sure, use your dead leaves, mix some browns, and at least put a number of brown things at the bottom of your bucket and add your greens on top. At the very least, do that.
And then we have a question. Can you have just one compost bin? And if so, or even if not, what do you recommend for new composters? And an entry-level compost bin.
You know, anything like this, something, these composters that you buy from Home Depot or, you know, these places, they have this door at the bottom. Some have 2 or 3 doors on different sides of the box, and some have a locking lid. This one is just a flip the lid open, which actually this particular type, sometimes the wind opens the door by itself. So it's good if you have a lid that kind of locks into place. Not necessarily, you know, with a locking mechanism, but just something that is hard to open, at least.
I use I have like a big black, I don't know, like a trash can, probably a 50-gallon trash can, maybe, with a good locking lid. And we, just like that, and we drilled holes in it so it gets oxygen there, and we just have a lot of carbon on the bottom, and that's kind of what I use. I do add it to a bin later after the summer, but that's kind of my go-to, where I put all my stuff in and then I transfer that.
Yeah.
So
and
is
that's
possible,
a really easy, cheap way to do it.
Yeah, is it possible just to have one composting bin?
Yeah, it's possible. I did that for years. And what you do is you have to mix it. So the ideal mixer is maybe a pitchfork, or they sell specialized sticks to mix your compost. But you have to make sure if you have only one bin, mix it, and you always take from the bottom and add to the top. And once in a while, you may take from the bottom and add it to the top just to mix it. But that's what I did for years. I just had the one bin, and it does work. It requires maybe a little more attention to mixing, or maybe it's not that much more work. I mean, you can, at the beginning, I was just dumping things in there, and I didn't have much browns, so it was mostly greens, and it was small quantities, so they just dried up in the corners, and it took forever to decompose. But you know, if that's what you're willing to do, sure. And it's quite feasible with one bin, especially if you have that door at the bottom. If you use the black garbage can with holes in it so it breathes a little bit, then you don't have a door at the bottom. So you have
it gets very heavy.
It gets, so you just have to flip it on its side on the ground, empty it on a tarp, and then put it back in. And I do use like a compost activator that I kind of sprinkle on my compost in the beginning of spring to kind of just get it going again. I could drop a link for that too, and that's actually a really easy way to kind of quicken it. Yeah, I think compost starters, and you can use that. I use something from the Biodynamic Association because that's the methodology that I kind of practice here. But you could, like, Manon might be willing to share some of her compost
that you could sprinkle on your home compost and activate it that way. Worm castings too, you know, those kind of juices are really easy compost activators. The one I use is a dried powder, and you just you put it in water and then kind of drizzle it on, and it's very cheap for the amount that it covers. I have like one packet and it's lasted me 5 years or something. So let me grab that link quickly.
And while she's looking for that, reminding you that Saturday we have this workshop, and we're asking people to bring a small quantity of their compost, and we will mix all of that together, all of our different compost, we will mix together, and then you go back home with the same quantity that you came in with, but you have more diversity, and you can use that as a compost activator.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a free workshop, so come and join us on Saturday.
Yeah, please join us.
So here I wanted to show this again, because in my black garbage can here, what I have is sod. So I've been removing sod. Every year I remove a little sod here and there. You can compost sod. Sod takes 2 years to decompose. You just, when you remove the sod, it has the greens on top and it has dirt at the bottom. It has topsoil at the bottom, right? And this is precious topsoil. So you just put the whole thing in a box. You can put sod facing sod and dirt facing sod, and you can pack that, leave it there for 2 years, and after 2 years, voila, you have a mix of compost and topsoil that is fantastic. And on the right, very right bottom corner, there's a little square box there. It's a little square planter. What I have in there is moose poop that I collected 2 weeks ago. And so I just mixed it with a little straw I had. So I have 1 layer of straw, 1 layer of poop, 1 layer of straw, 1 layer of poop, 1 layer of, and I end with the straw on top so that my manure can compost. And eventually I'll add this whole bin to the new Grange compost system. We're starting at the Grange next week, next Saturday. And so here's a picture of the 3-bin system we will be constructing, like the top one, but we're doing it from pallets. We are using recycled pallets, and we'll construct something like the top bin, but we'll find a way to have a door in front, and we'll probably cover it on top. If you don't cover it, it will dehydrate and you'll have to water it more. So if you have a system like this that is not covered, it just gets dehydrated really fast. If you're in a coastal climate and it's humid, it's fine. But if otherwise, you might have to water it too much, and you may not want to do that. And we're getting at the end of our time, so I want to talk a little bit about vermicomposting. So you see some red wiggler worms here in the hand. This is my composting system in my back entrance. And this is me feeding my worms on Wednesday morning. Every Wednesday I feed my worms. So I give them whatever I accumulated in this container that was in my fridge, full of coffee grinds. And I put that on one side. I kind of divide the box on 2 sides, and this box has several trays. But I put this on one side, and I add the wet newspaper on top of it. And then you cover it up and you wait another week until you feed them again. And you can see a few worms here on the sides, but as soon as Amy said, the worms live on top, but as soon as you lift the lid, they don't like the light. So they quickly go run under the newspaper or under their poop, really. So it's very simple. Once a week you feed them, and then you get a very rich compost out of that. And if you're thinking of starting a compost, a vermicompost, there's a company here, Whitehead Landscaping. the son of the dad started this whitehead vermicompost. So he's doing industrial vermicompost, and he now sells vermicomposting system like the one I showed you. And he'll sell you the worms, and he also sells the worm castings and the compost tea. Voila.
Manon, a couple things. Could you go back 2 slides I see where it shows the green? Yeah, could you talk about how you use those different trays? And also, somehow I was missing when you put your vegetable materials and then your newspaper materials, do you mix that up?
Mm-hmm.
So if you could talk about
when you start your bin for the first time, you would use, like, the bottom part here is just a liquid container so that things drip. If there's any liquid, they will drip in the bottom part. But the first tray, so I have three trays there, and they all have like a grid at the bottom, so they drain well and they breathe also. There's oxygen going through. So when you start, you add newspaper that you shred, just in strips of about 1/2 inch. And you make that a little moist, but not too wet again. And you put that at the bottom, and you add 1 pound of worms. That's how you start. And that newspaper, we call that the bedding. So you need enough of that so that the worms can really live in it. And you can add some compost in there, some soil, some coffee grinds when you start. And then you feed them, every week. So when when you start with your first tray, you always add your greens to your first tray, and you add more newspaper to that. And once your tray is pretty full, or more than half, maybe 2/3 full, then you start the process and your second tray that's on top of it. And you only put your greens in the top one at that point. And the worms, once they finish eating everything in your bottom tray, they'll migrate to your second tray. And then once your second tray is almost full, you start on the third tray again. And the worms migrate to your third tray. At that point, there should be no more worms, or very few worms left in your bottom tray. So you can remove your bottom tray and harvest your worm castings. And by that time, the newspaper bedding will all be decomposed. They will have eaten the whole thing, or it will have decomposed by microorganisms as well. And so then you take that bottom tray. I put the contents of that in a bucket, in a white bucket. And if it's a little too wet for my taste, I let it dehydrate for a little bit, and then I cover it up so it doesn't get too dry. And then it's ready to use as a compost. And I just clean my tray, put it on top, and restart the process with the top one. It becomes my top tray the next time around. Does that answer the question?
Yes, we seem to have a lot of questions about worms. So where your cursor is, that particular tray looks like, I'm guessing 4 inches thick, but the 2 above it seem shallower. Is that just an
That's because they're inside the other.
Okay.
They're not shallower. They're all the same size. They're probably 5 or 6 inches high, but they're sunk into the next one. So they're sitting directly on top of the contents of the tray below, so that the worms can migrate easily from one to the other. If you have too much space in between your trays, the worms won't be able to travel so easily. They'll have to climb on the edges and then go in, which they could do, but it's more efficient if they can go through the holes at the bottom when it's in contact.
So a couple more questions. Someone asked, the questions are rolling in. Can this be done in the garage? And then a follow-up question from Susan. Do the worms require a minimum temperature, a maximum temperature? And then a question about food, but let's talk about the garage and temperatures first.
Yeah, well, let's start with temperature. They prefer room temperature. So anything from 65 to 75, they like.
As long
So
as they
that,
don't freeze or fry, they'll be okay. They just might not be as active in a 50-degree garage as at room temperature, but they'll survive still.
yeah, they will survive a light frost for a day or two. But if you leave it outside and it freezes at -20, it might kill off all the live worms. It might leave some larvae in there or not, because they're tropical worms. Remember, they're not used to our climate.
And as far as heat goes, like I had my bin in my kind of greenhouse this summer and it got really hot in there and the worms got a little sad, but they're fine. It probably got up to 120 in the greenhouse in direct sun, which isn't desirable, but I think this is one thing that everyone should just think about is you don't have to be a perfect composter or a perfect worm keeper to make this work for you. Whatever works for you, whatever space you have, it's better than nothing. So don't be deterred by, oh, I don't have a perfect room temperature space for it.
Right.
There's a little flex there.
Yeah. So if they're too hot or they're too cold, they'll go dormant.
Yeah.
And so if you want them to produce, which means to eat what you're giving them and to poop a lot because you're collecting their poop, they'll be more efficient within the room temperature range. But I have done, now I do it in my house because now my husband accepts it. At the beginning, he would not allow. He allowed it in the garage with frowns at the beginning. But in the winter, the garage never froze, but it would get down to 40 degrees. And at 40 degrees, they go dormant. They just stay there and they weren't eating much, but they won't die.
Just a comment on that. Narda Pitcathly does a lot with worms, and she worked with CKs for many years. She may still. But there's a huge worm bin, or was, on the north side of CK's outside that she maintained with their help. They collaborated for many years, which is amazing that it was outside on the north side, and throughout the winter they put scraps in there. And I think she explained that part of what she thought happened was it was composting, was that it generated the worm bin, which was big. I mean, it's like 6 or 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, that it actually generated its own heat.
Right.
And that kept the worms alive outside. But
absolutely. It's like the hot composting system I told you about. If you have a big mass, it gets warmer. It keeps its own heat. Yeah. And that box was insulated.
It was well insulated.
It had foam all around.
Yep, and had a cover, and it did. And it had like some sort of big tarp over the top.
Plus they were adding warm things from the kitchen every day into it. So they were keeping it warm enough. Yeah.
So Susan has continues with a question. Could you just put the food scraps in a container in the freezer and defrost completely before feeding the worms? Or would that freezing affect the materials?
No, that would work. It would actually make the material softer, and the worms won't eat, your fresh lettuce. They'll eat it when it's kind of limp and starting to decompose. Yeah, they won't mind, as long as you don't give it to them frozen. Yeah, let it defrost first.
So we're just about to lose Catherine, or maybe we have lost Catherine already. She says, thank you so much for putting this on. I'm sorry, but I have to leave the meeting right now. I have a lot to learn, but want to start a bin. Like you, I tried it years ago and was a failure. Maybe I'm older and wiser now. Ha ha, have a good night. So
very sweet.
That was such a nice little message that I wanted to share it with you.
There's nothing like learning by doing. Just try it, see what works and what doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, ask someone else. Like when I started my compost bin, I had Kristen look at it and she said, oh, you have centipedes in there, and centipedes are predators to your worms. Oh.
I had just read that, actually. I was no authority. I just happened to read that, a few days
Well,
ago.
that was really great. And what happened is that I had put my worms outside, and when I brought them back inside, there were other bugs in there, including pill bugs and centipedes. And yeah, I was able to remove the centipedes one by one, chasing them day after day. But the pill bugs are actually good decomposers as well. So my bin actually has both pill bugs and red wiggler worms.
And we didn't really talk about how to use vermicompost, the materials, the worm castings. So maybe quickly we just say you can amend your soil with them. You can mix them into water and fertilize with that water. I know Narda has in the past sold dried worm castings where they're in a bag and she's dried them out. So if you have a lot, you can dry them out on plywood or something out in the sunshine. And that way you have them.
Put it in your dehydrator.
In your dehydrator, yeah, and that way you have it to sprinkle on your potted plants throughout the winter.
But oftentimes what I do, because I have both my outdoor system and my indoor system, in the spring, I put all of my worm castings into my outdoor bin.
It's great, yeah.
And sometimes I keep a bucket with worm castings in it, and I add that to my seed starting mix. But most of the time, I just add it to my bin to add diversity.
One of the things I learned, I had a worm bin at the botanical garden, which was mostly successful for a while, and then it wasn't successful. But when I was trying to just learn about it, because I didn't know beans, one of the things I learned is that because the castings come out from the digestive system of the worm, that it's actually the castings are coated with a light coating of mucus, and that light coating of mucus just sort of becomes part of the castings. And then when you, soak the castings in water or break it down or however you're going to use it, that little bit of mucus stays on the worm casting particles. And then when you add it to the plants, it actually serves to let the nutrients that are in the worm castings stick to the roots and into the soil rather than being washed through. So, which I thought was just really nifty. And
it's
if
very
you
cool.
Take your castings and add water and do like a compost tea, it still serves that same function. That little bit of mucus permeates throughout your whole mixture and all that good stuff, which is incredibly available, readily used by plants. There's something that I can't remember about it, but it is very easily absorbed by plants. So
that's fascinating. I did not know that, but that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and I want to get a worm bin now, so I'm really excited about it. So
we have one worm bin at the Grange that was donated at the last seed exchange, and so we're willing to give it away for a small donation.
Oh, is it one of those green ones?
It's the same thing, but it's black instead of green.
Okay. Well,
but it's the same system. It's I don't think it's been used. It's very clean.
Oh.
So yeah, because I think it's worth about $100 or close.
Yeah, they're about $100 new. I've seen them. I bought mine at the thrift store a few years ago. So every once in a while, you might be able to find them thrifted, but grab them when you see them.
Well, probably everybody on this call would like a worm bin. We should have a drawing or something.
Well, whoever comes and gets it first gets it.
And if you folks, we're getting close to the end and I can't unmute you, but you can unmute yourselves if you want. If you have any like follow-up questions, we can maybe take 3 or 4 questions. If Manon, Amy, if you're okay with going a little bit later.
Sure.
Sure.
And we're available. Yes, Kathleen, and we're available afterwards. You can call us. You can email us. If you send something to Kristen, she'll forward it to us.
I thought this was great. This is my third Zoom with the library and you all, and I just think you do a great job. I'm a master gardener in Louisiana, but this year I've been in Idaho like 8 months, so I'm trying to get my Idaho up, and I'll be back soon and start working on these things. I love it.
Great. Nice
Great.
meeting you.
Welcome. Yeah.
Please do come to one of our events so we can meet in person.
Oh, I definitely, I want to. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
you inspired me to do seeds, and I did seeds, and they did really well.
Wonderful.
That was a year ago. So keep doing the good work. Yeah.
And on Saturday, we're also having, some people are bringing things that they want to exchange, like pots and trays and sticks. And so anything gardening that you want to exchange, bring them Saturday. And we have a seed exchange, 2 seed exchanges in the spring, every spring. So it's great. It's so great. It's such a great community to talk and exchange.
You know, Linda just posted something in the chat. She asks, if compost gets slimy in that horrible way that I mentioned, can adding browns correct the situation, or is it too late to fix? I personally, based on my experience of almost losing, you know how we have dogs we love and then we have heart dogs, the ones that they're just your heart. She was just my heart. And even the thought of losing her brings tears to my eyes. So I would not risk a high level of neurotoxins and try to offset that. I think that
it depends what state it's in. You know, if it's beginning, I would try. You know, if it's just you're realizing it's beginning and it hasn't been too long, I would mix a lot of dead leaves with it and see if it depends on the smell also. If I smell something, although botulism may not have the smell, I'm not sure. But typically, if a compost pile has an odor that you know really is offensive to you, I would not. You know, but if it's you know beginning and it doesn't smell that bad, yeah, add a lot of browns. And the microorganisms, there are natural antibiotics in this microbiome that will kill the bad bacteria. So
yeah, that might be where a compost starter would help a lot too. Like to add browns and a compost starter to that might just kind of kick it into composting decomposition.
Especially if it's natural browns and not newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
This was my neighbor's, not mine. Yeah, you just open and it's like, oh my God, it was bad.
Yeah.
So, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, if we don't have any more questions from anybody, on behalf of Amy and Manon, and you guys can chime in too, of course, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was a great talk, and I will, as quickly as I can turn it around, I will send an email out with you with that survey that I mentioned, some of these resources that Amy and Manon shared with us.